Welcome to the Ben Wood Johnson podcast. You can visit Dr. Johnson's blog at benwoodpost.com. Dr. Johnson's works can be found at drbenwoodjohnson.com. You can also support Dr. Johnson on Patreon, the link to which is in the description. Hey, welcome to the Ben Wood Johnson podcast. Today is February the 3rd, 2020, and this is podcast number 43. We are still talking about time. Yes, it is a somewhat difficult concept to explain, but hopefully I'll try to make sense of it all. Here in this podcast, I talk about time in terms of how it is perceived by human beings and how time actually is, at least the way I understand it. In this particular entry, we talked about time in terms of being segmented in three sections. There's the past, the present, and the future. I refute the understanding that time goes from the past to the present and into the future. I argue that time goes from the past and into the future, and that future is lived as the present. So time is always pushed forward, and there's this constant going back and forth between the past and the future. That's what gives you the present. So it is a somewhat difficult concept to explain, but I'll try my best. So without further ado, let us delve right into it. Presently, time is understood as point A to point B and point C. Time vacillates between point A and point C. That is how time is understood right now. Time is understood like this. There's a point in which time starts, and there's a particular point where time ends. There's a point where time is supposed to go. So as it goes where it's supposed to go, and it keeps going back to the point where it came from. And that back and forth creates the loop of the universe. When one thinks of time, what usually comes to mind is the notion that it starts here, and as you go along, you go somewhere we call the future. So in other words, there's a point A and there is a point B. That's what we usually think of time. But in reality, indeed, there is a point A. Okay? As there's a point A, there is a point B. And the point B is the point where we're going. But in between, there's a point C. And the point C that's in between is the point where we are. This point C is the present. However, it is understood as both future and past, because it is a point that vacillates between the present, or between point A and point B. And that is why, as we understand time, it is erroneous, because there's absolutely no way that we're going to have a point A that is going to a point B. However, as it goes to point B, it never gets to point B, because it keeps going back and forth between point C and point A. And because it never gets to point B, B becomes this future that the present, which is the point C, is aspiring to. Now, why is the present point C? Why isn't the present point B? Or why isn't the present B? The present cannot be B, because if the present is B, it is assumed that there is no future. Because if the present is B, there is no future. Future is just a possibility. That's if we were to look at it from A, B, C, it would mean that there is no future. Because future would be a possibility, not something that will certainly not a certainty. Okay? That's what it would mean. But in reality, the future is a certainty. And because the future is a certainty, the future must be the point where we know we're going to be, which is the point that is between the point of departure and the point of arrival. That's what the future must be. The future cannot be the point of the present. Because if the present is the present, the future is the possibility. Whereby one never leaves the past. That's the only way B can be in the middle. As if we never leave the past. Okay? Because if you never leave the past, okay, you never leave the past, and you're going through this motion in which you go from point A to point B, and from point B to point C, then the question becomes, you don't have a present, or you don't have a past. That's all it means, okay? Because point A is basically, at the moment that it is your point A, it is your present. Because if point A is your present, the minute you move beyond point A, you're no longer in the present. And since you're no longer in the present, because it is your present, going to point B assumes that point B is a point where the present begins. And if point B is the point where the present begins, there is no future. A future is a possibility, whereby one can envision the future. Okay? That's how it's understood. That is not how it is, however, but that's how it's understood. In other words, there are 3 points. Okay? But the problem with this theory is that those 3 points overlap. They overlap and not in the positive relationship and the negative relationship. From point A to point C, and from point C to point B. And point B being the point where everybody aspires to go. Point B is the future. But you cannot be at point B. You will never reach point B. Because you get to point C, which is supposed to be the real future you're aspiring for, right? And you're stuck at point C. And point C keeps taking you back and forth between point B and point A. In other words, point C, which is in the middle, keeps taking you to point B, meaning keeps taking you to the possibility of the future, keeps showing you the future, keeps showing you the possibility of point B, but keeps pulling you back to point A. In other words, keeps taking you back where you started. Keeps taking you back to point A. And it's that constant in between. That's back and forth between point A and point B is the point C where you are, and that point C is the present. Because the point C is not a destination. Point C is not a destination. In other words, you're not aiming at going to the present. You're never aiming at going to the present. The present is just living. It's just there. But it is never your goal to be at the present, to go to the present. It is always your goal to be to the future. Your goal is to get to point B. But you can't get to point B because point C keeps taking you back to point A and keeps showing you point B. And then point C becomes this present. And therefore, point C in itself is a point that you're supposed to have after you reach point B. You understand? In other words, you're supposed to be in the future once you pass the present. But you can never pass the present. And the reason you can never pass the present is because the present in and of itself is the opposite of the future. So in other words, you can never pass the present as long as you are in between the present and the future. So this creates a dilemma, because on one point you want to get to the future, which is point B, but you may never get to point B because point B does not exist in reality. Point B does not exist in reality. Point B is a mirage. Point B is just an illusion. The reality in itself is point C. Point C is the point where you are after you left point A. But point C is not the destination. Point C, it is the point beyond point B. Okay? In other words, after you reach point B, that's when you should reach point C. In other words, the present is lived. From the present, you aspire to a future. And once you reach that future, you're supposed to enjoy that future in the present. In other words, it would be from point A to point B, and from point B to point C. And point C being the present, and point B being the future. But it can never be that way, because if you're going to go from point A to point B, so that means you would have to leave your future before you can enjoy your present, and that would be flawed. That's not how nature operates. However, that's how nature is understood. Nature is understood, or at least human beings understand time within the confine of going from point A. The goal from point A is to get to point C. And point C from their perspective being the future. Okay? And if I'm going from point A to point C, point B is the point in between, which symbolizes the present. Then the question one must ask, if I'm going to go from point A to point C, when I reach point B, which is the present, how do I get to point C from point B if point B is the opposite of point C? In other words, the present is the opposite of the future. The present is not the opposite of the past. The present is a reflection of the past. But the present is the opposite of the future. In other words, the present is everything the future is not yet. The present is everything that the future is not going to be. Okay? Because if the present is similar to the future, then it's not the future. It is the present. Does that make sense? No, it doesn't make sense. It makes sense to me. So I wonder if it makes sense to you. The present is only the present when it is different from the future. At the same time, similar to the past. So in that sense, the present is a reflection of the past. And the future is the opposite of the present. Then how do we get to the present, to the future, from the present, which is the opposite? So in other words, I cannot be from a point where I am non-existent to a point where I am existent. In order for me to be from a non-existence to an existence, I must have been a non-existent. And that non-existence that's what's going to create the possibility for my existence. And that possibility for my existence in itself is what the future is. The future is the possibility for that existence. In other words, the present is what it is. The present is a reflection of the past. In other words, the present is a reflection of the being of the past. Okay? That's all the present is. And in order to get from the past to the future, it's impossible. Because you have to bridge the present. You have to go from the past to the present, and from the present to the future. But there is no bridge between the present and the future. You see what I'm saying? There is no bridge between the present and the future. Every future experience, as understood by human beings, is felt or experienced in the present. So that's the reason why the future that is supposedly the C point can never be before the present, which is the B point. That is the reason why from point A to point C, you have to get point B, you have to get to point C before you get to point B. In other words, before you go from point A to point B, you have to get to point C, which is the future, that is different from both the present and the past. And that difference between the present and the past is this constant. There's this constant in between the present and the past where you keep going back and forth between the past and the possibility of the future. In other words, the past keeps reminding the future, which is C, of what the present is, so that the future can adjust to what the past used to be. Okay? Does it make any sense? Okay. So to put this in another term, from point A to point B, point A being the past, point B being the present, one has to go through point C, which is the future. Okay? And going through point C, which is the future, is where life stops. Okay? It is where everything in nature stops. Everything in nature stops between this constant between the past and the possibility of the future. And this constant in between, back and forth. And the back and forth is so rapid that it creates a constant. It creates a constant in between. And that constant in between, that's what the present is. That's what the burst of present is. The burst of present is this in between, back and forth between the past and the possibility of the present, of the future. And that constant back and forth, that's what informs time. In other words, that's what time is. It is bold. Okay. All right. Right now I am in the parking lot. I'm gonna go buy some groceries right here. I'm gonna buy a few items, and after that I'll come back to this idea and see where it takes me.